In 1937, Henry Ford sent a crew to 1127 West 3rd Street in Dayton, Ohio. They disassembled a two-story wooden building, loaded it onto trucks, and drove it north to Dearborn, Michigan. The building was a former bicycle shop. It was also the place where Orville and Wilbur Wright had built a 6-foot wind tunnel, tested over 200 wing shapes, and constructed the airplane that flew at Kitty Hawk. Ford wanted it for his museum. Dayton let it go. The lot it left behind is still empty. That empty lot tells you almost everything you need to know about this city. Because Dayton, Ohio, at the turn of the 20th century, held more patents per capita than any city in the United States. It was producing the airplane, the cash register, the automobile self-starter, the pull-top can, the barcode, the search engine. By one estimate, a sixth of all American business executives in the early 20th century had trained at a single Dayton company. The city was the original Silicon Valley, except nobody calls it that because everything Dayton invented eventually left. The ideas left, the companies left, the people left. And in 1937, they started taking the buildings, too. This is a story about what happens to a place that's better at creating things than keeping them. Dayton sits where the Great Miami River meets three of its tributaries, the Stillwater, the Mad River, and Wolf Creek, in the flat, fertile stretch of southwestern Ohio. It was founded in 1796 and named after Jonathan Dayton, a signer of the Constitution who owned land in the area, but as far as anyone knows, never actually visited. The rivers were the reason the city existed. They powered the mills, floated the goods, and connected Dayton to the Miami and Erie Canal in the 1830s, opening markets all the way to Lake Erie. By the time the railroads arrived in the 1850s, Dayton was already a town of small manufacturers, tool makers, machinists, carriage builders, foundries. People who worked with their hands and understood how things fit together. The Barney and Smith Car Company, founded in 1849, grew into one of the largest railroad car manufacturers in the country, turning out luxury Pullman coaches from teak and mahogany in enormous riverside shops. By the 1870s, Dayton ranked 5th in the nation for patents per capita. By 1890, it was first. This was not because of any single genius. It was because of density. Hundreds of small firms, thousands of machinists, a deep pool of skilled labor that could be applied to almost any mechanical problem someone walked in the door with. That pool would turn out to be the most important resource Dayton ever had. The first great Dayton invention came from a saloon keeper. James Ritty ran a bar and had a problem common to every bar owner in America. His employees were stealing from him. In 1879, on a steamship to Europe, Ritty watched a mechanism that counted the revolutions of the ship's propeller, and an idea took shape. He went home to Dayton, and with his brother John, a machinist, he built a machine with keys that recorded each transaction and locked the cash inside a drawer. He called it Ritty's Incorruptible Cashier. It was the first mechanical cash register. Ritty was a bartender, not a businessman, and in 1881 he sold the patent for $1,000. It was possibly the worst deal in Dayton history, and Dayton would produce a remarkable number of bad deals over the next century and a quarter. The patent ended up with a small outfit called the National Manufacturing Company, which had managed to sell exactly 359 registers when a coal merchant named John Henry Patterson walked in. Patterson had bought 2 of those 359 machines for his coal yard in Colton, 100 miles southeast of Dayton, and the results were immediate. His business went from $16,000 in debt to $5,000 in profit within 6 months. Patterson was 41 years old, a Dartmouth graduate, and a man of violent enthusiasms. He bought the entire company in 1884, renamed it the National Cash Register Company, and set about doing something that no one had done before, creating demand for a product nobody knew they needed. There was no market for cash registers. Shopkeepers didn't understand what they did. Patterson decided to teach them. He created a professional sales force, the first of its kind, with standardized scripts, territories, commissions, and annual conventions. He gave them canned presentations and taught them to dress well. He invented direct mail advertising. He built the first corporate suggestion box. He opened the first sales training school on the NCR factory grounds in 1893. That same year, he tore down his old factory and built something the country had never seen, a daylight factory with floor-to-ceiling glass windows, spacious lawns, landscaping designed by John Charles Olmsted, and amenities for workers that included a swimming pool, a library, daily calisthenics, and a medical clinic. In an era when sweatshops were normal, Patterson was building a campus. Workers called the company the Cash. By 1914, NCR was producing 110,000 registers a year. Patterson was a visionary, and also, by most accounts, a lunatic. He was a health fanatic who imposed his dietary obsessions on his executives. He fired people constantly, often for trivial reasons, failing an equestrian exercise, not knowing why the company flags were flying that day. He once fired Charles Kettering with the remark, "Anybody who can't handle a horse can't handle men." His most consequential termination was Thomas Watson Sr., who had risen to sales manager and lived in the house and drove the Pierce Arrow that Patterson had bestowed upon him. Watson left NCR in 1914, vowing to build a bigger business than Patterson had. He went to a struggling company called the Computing Tabulating Recording Corporation, renamed it International Business Machines, and did exactly that. IBM became the most powerful technology company on Earth, and it was built by a man Dayton threw away. Watson was not the exception. He was the pattern. Patterson's NCR was a machine for producing executives. It trained them, refined them, and then, through firing, frustration, or opportunity, ejected them into the wider world. By the 1920s, it was estimated that 1 in 6 heads of major American corporations had passed through NCR. The company's methods, scripted sales pitches, guaranteed territories, annual quotas, lavish conventions, became the standard playbook of American business. Patterson had not just built a cash register company. He had built a school for American capitalism, and the graduates kept leaving. Patterson didn't seem to mind. A factory, he said, is a collection of human beings. He meant it as a philosophy of management. It was also a prophecy about what would happen to Dayton. The humans would go, and the factory would be left behind. 2 of those graduates would change the world more than Watson did, though their invention would stay in Dayton a little longer. Charles Kettering was a farm boy from Loudonville, Ohio, who got an electrical engineering degree from Ohio State and came to work at NCR in 1904. His first contribution was designing a small electric motor that could open a cash register drawer, the first electric cash register. His boss was Edward Deeds, NCR's general manager, and the 2 men shared a fascination with automobiles. In their spare time, working in a barn behind Deeds's house on Central Avenue, they developed a high-energy ignition system that could replace the weak spark models that came standard on early cars. When Henry Leland at Cadillac ordered 5,000 ignition sets, Kettering and Deeds knew they had something too big for a side project. In 1909, they incorporated the Dayton Engineering Laboratories Company, Delco, and quit NCR to run it. Kettering's great breakthrough came next. In 1911, the friend of Leland's named Byron Carter had stopped to help a woman crank start her stalled car on a Detroit bridge. The crank kicked back, broke Carter's jaw, and he died of complications weeks later. Leland, grief-stricken, asked Kettering to solve the problem. Kettering adapted the principle of the cash register motor, a device that delivered a short, intense burst of electricity, and created the first practical electric self-starter. It debuted on the 1912 Cadillac and made the automobile accessible to anyone who could turn a key. Before Kettering, driving a car required the strength to crank a heavy flywheel and the reflexes to dodge it when it kicked. After Kettering, driving required a finger. The self-starter made cars accessible to women, to older drivers, to anyone who wasn't a young man with strong arms. Within a decade, electric self-starters came standard on nearly every new automobile. It was possibly the most consequential invention in automotive history, and it came from a cash register engineer in Dayton, Ohio, working in a barn. Delco became a subsidiary of General Motors in 1918. Kettering moved to Detroit to run GM's research labs, a position he held for 27 years, accumulating 186 patents along the way. Freon for refrigeration, leaded gasoline, fast-drying automobile paint, the lightweight diesel engine. He became Boss Kett, one of the most celebrated inventors in America. His name lives on in Kettering, Ohio, the Dayton suburb named for him, and in the Sloan Kettering Institute in New York. His laboratory, however, is in Michigan. His patents belong to General Motors. Meanwhile, on West 3rd Street, two brothers were running a bicycle shop. Orville and Wilbur Wright had opened the Wright Cycle Exchange in 1892 during the great bicycle craze, and they were good at it. In their best year, 1897, they earned $3,000, when the average American worker was lucky to make $500. They sold well-known brands and eventually manufactured their own models, the Van Cleve and the St. Clair, assembled by hand. But the bicycle business was really a funding mechanism. The Wrights were obsessed with flight. The profits from the shop, about $5,000 saved over several years, financed their aviation experiments entirely. They built a 6-foot wind tunnel on the second floor of their shop at 1127 West 3rd Street and tested over 200 airfoil shapes. They sewed wings in the parlor of the family home at 7 Hawthorne Street. The Wright Flyer that flew at Kitty Hawk on December 17, 1903, cost less than $1,000 to build. What made Dayton essential to flight was not any single resource. It was the ecosystem. The Wrights were surrounded by machinists who could fabricate parts to close tolerances, by an industrial culture that treated mechanical problem-solving as ordinary work, and by a city where a bicycle repairman tinkering with airfoils was not particularly unusual because everybody was tinkering with something. Charlie Taylor, a local machinist they hired in 1901, built the first airplane engine in their bicycle shop, a custom 4-cylinder block that weighed 152 pounds and produced 12 horsepower. He built it in 6 weeks. That was normal in Dayton. The city was a place where gifted machinists were available on short notice because gifted machinists were everywhere. After Kitty Hawk, the Wrights came back to Dayton. They continued testing at Huffman Prairie, 8 miles east of town, where they perfected the 1905 Flyer 3, the first truly practical airplane, capable of sustained, controlled flight. In 1909, they converted their bicycle shop into a machine shop for the Wright Company, the first airplane manufacturer in the United States. The company built its factory in Dayton, and then the pattern repeated. In 1915, Orville sold the company. In 1916, Kettering and Deeds, along with Harold Talbot, founded the Dayton Wright Airplane Company. GM bought it in 1919, and in 1937, Henry Ford showed up and took the building. By then, Dayton had already survived the worst natural disaster in Ohio history. On March 23, 1913, Easter Sunday, a series of storms began dumping rain on the Miami Valley. 8 to 11 inches fell over 5 days onto soil already saturated from a wet winter. The Great Miami River and its 3 tributaries rose at a terrifying rate, nearly 2 feet per hour by midnight on March 25th. At around 6 a.m. on the 25th, the levees broke. 250,000 cubic feet of water per second poured through a channel built to handle 25,000. By 1:30 a.m. on March 26th, downtown Dayton was under 20 feet of water. Gas lines ruptured, and an explosion at Wilkinson and 5th Street ignited a city block. The fire department couldn't reach it because the streets were rivers. At the Dayton Public Library, librarian Minnie Altoff was lifting books to higher shelves when she noticed water running along the floor. Suddenly there was a terrific noise, she later recalled. The east doors and windows were thrown violently open, and a great surge of black, muddy water rushed in like a tidal wave upon us. She screamed for her colleagues and dashed for the stairway. The library lost 46,000 volumes. More than 360 people across the city died. 65,000 were displaced. 20,000 buildings were damaged or destroyed. Teak and mahogany from the Barney and Smith Car Company shops, soaked loose from 14 feet of floodwater, floated down the Great Miami and was found as far downriver as New Orleans. Property damage reached $100 million, roughly $2.5 billion today. The Dayton Sanitation Department's report for the month after tells its own story. 133,600 wagon loads of debris removed. 13,991 houses and cellars cleaned and disinfected. 1,420 dead horses and 2,000 other dead animals hauled away. And then John Patterson did the best thing he ever did. Just the year before, in 1912, Patterson and 27 other NCR executives, including Thomas Watson, had been found guilty of violating the Sherman Antitrust Act for illegal sales practices, intimidating competitors, sabotaging rival machines, selling below cost to destroy smaller firms. They were sentenced to a year in prison. Patterson was, at that moment, arguably the most hated industrialist in Ohio. Then the water came, and he converted his NCR factory on Stewart Street into an emergency shelter. He ordered his workers to build flat-bottomed rescue boats, 275 of them assembled on the factory floor, and he organized teams to pull stranded people off rooftops. More than 10,000 were rescued. NCR served 2,750 meals a day. Thousands slept in the factory. One journalist wrote that NCR was, for days, the stricken city's brain, nerves, almost its food and drink. The week had its ironies. Patterson and 27 other NCR executives, including Thomas Watson, had been convicted of antitrust violations just the year before. The order formalizing Patterson's emergency authority was signed by James Cox, the governor of Ohio, who had previously been Patterson's adversary at the Dayton Daily News. The flood that nearly killed Dayton also redeemed its most difficult citizen. In 1915, Patterson's conviction was overturned on appeal. The court ruled that important defense evidence should have been admitted, and he was never retried. The public, which had watched him rescue their neighbors from rooftops, had no appetite for seeing him in prison. Patterson's final gift to the city came from the flood, too. He championed a radical response, the Miami Conservancy District, one of the first major flood control systems in the United States. Hydrological engineer Arthur Morgan designed a series of 5 dry dams across the watershed. Construction began in 1918 and was completed in 1922 at a cost of $32 million. The system has protected Dayton from severe flooding more than 1,500 times since. Patterson died on May 7, 1922, 2 days after reviewing plans with General Billy Mitchell to build an aviation research center in Dayton, the facility that would become Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. He left no great fortune. Shrouds have no pockets, he liked to say. His personal income in his later years was about $500,000, but he spent almost none of it on himself. His son, Frederick, took over the company. The following January, Dillon, Reed & Company offered $55 million in NCR stock to the public in what the New York Times called the largest single stock offering in the history of the country. The Dayton that Patterson left behind was already building on its aviation legacy. McCook Field, a military research airfield established in 1917, had become a center for testing everything from parachutes. The first free-fall jump from an airplane using a backpack parachute was made there in 1919, to high-altitude equipment. It was at McCook that the military first experimented with aerial refueling, with pressurized flight suits, with the instruments that would make flying at night and in poor weather possible. When McCook outgrew its site, it was replaced by Wright Field in 1927, which eventually merged with nearby Patterson Field to form Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. The base would become one of the largest military installations in the country, and in time, the last pillar holding up what was left of Dayton's economy. The city was entering its golden age, and it was building monuments to match. The Dayton Arcade, conceived by Eugene Barney of the Barney and Smith Car Company and designed by architect Frank Andrews, had opened in 1904 as a complex of 9 interconnecting buildings anchored by a spectacular glass-domed rotunda, 70 feet high, 90 feet across, decorated not with the classical motifs you'd expect, but with symbols of Ohio. Cornucopias spilling fruits and vegetables, garlands of oak leaves and acorns, festoons of grain, wild turkeys carved in stone at the base of each dome rib. It was an indoor market, a food hall, a shopping arcade, and a civic monument all at once. Daytonians called it the crown jewel of the Gem City. On the arcade's opening night in March 1904, crowds filed through corridors of marble archways to 2 levels of vendor stalls, fishmongers, butchers, florists, bakers, beneath the soaring glass dome. There were 200 stalls, a cold storage plant, elevators, and a private power station. Barney had spent 2 years building it, and it was the most ambitious commercial structure between Cincinnati and Columbus. In 1912, the Reich Kumler department store opened its grand new building at 2nd and Main. 11 stories with hundreds of employees and customers arriving from 75 miles away. Thousands attended the opening. In 1929, the Dayton Biltmore Hotel opened at 1st and Main, a 16-story Beaux-Arts tower in brick and terracotta, one of the finest hotels in the Biltmore chain. It opened on November 16, 1929, 17 days after Black Tuesday. The timing was terrible for the hotel and perfect for the city's sense of itself. Dayton built grand things even at the edge of catastrophe. Over the decades, the Biltmore would host John F. Kennedy, Elvis Presley, and the sort of business conventions that proved a city was serious. Downtown Dayton in the 1930s and 1940s was a place of weight. Department stores with restaurants and toy floors and Christmas window displays, office towers full of insurance men and engineers, factory whistles marking the shifts. And then came the war, and Dayton did something so important and so secret that nobody heard about it for 50 years. In early 1942, the German Navy added a 4th rotor to its Enigma cipher machine, plunging Allied intelligence into darkness. German U-boats were sinking supply ships in the Atlantic at a rate that threatened the entire war effort. The British, under Alan Turing at Bletchley Park, had cracked earlier versions of the code, but the 4-rotor Enigma was beyond their existing machines. The U.S. Navy needed a new code-breaking device, faster, more powerful, built at industrial scale. They chose NCR. Joe Desch was a West Side Dayton kid, born in the Edgemont neighborhood, educated at the University of Dayton. He was a floor-trained electrical engineer who had already invented an electronic counter capable of 1,000,000 counts per second, 100 times faster than anything that existed, which was being used, unknown to Desch, in the Manhattan Project. In 1942, at age 35, Desch was put in charge of building the American Bomb, a 5,000-pound electromechanical machine designed to work through the billions of possible Enigma rotor combinations until it found the right one. He worked in Building 26 on the NCR campus, a windowless Art Deco structure next to the railroad tracks, convenient for nighttime shipments. Armed Marines surrounded the building. 600 waves, women accepted for volunteer emergency service, assembled the components, and later operated the finished machines in Washington. Alan Turing himself visited Dayton on December 21, 1942, and slept on the floor of Desch's modest house in Oakwood because the spare bedroom was already occupied by a Navy commander. Turing was skeptical of Desch's approach. Desch ignored him and kept building. The first American bombs went operational in May 1943. Eventually, 121 were built, each one 5,000 pounds of wheels, rotors, and wiring designed to work like an Enigma machine in reverse. They were shipped to Washington, where 3,000 people, mostly waves, operated them around the clock, cracking Enigma traffic that revealed U-boat positions, rerouted convoys, and, by the estimation of historians, shortened the war by 2 years and saved millions of lives. Eisenhower himself credited the intelligence produced by the machines, known as Ultra, as decisive. Desch received the Presidential Medal of Merit from Harry Truman. And then everything was classified. Desch couldn't tell anyone what he'd done. He carried the secret until he died in 1987, and the full story didn't emerge until 2001, when the Dayton Daily News ran an 8-part series based on research by his daughter, Deborah Anderson. Of the 121 bombs built in Dayton, exactly 1 survives in the National Cryptologic Museum at Fort Meade, Maryland. Building 26 was demolished by the University of Dayton in 2008. Dayton couldn't even keep the building where it helped win the war. The 1950s were the summit. The population hit 262,332 in the 1960 census, the 49th largest city in America. Dayton held the largest concentration of General Motors employees outside of Michigan. 11 GM plants in the area employed 41,800 workers. NCR was still headquartered on Patterson Boulevard, its campus now sprawling across hundreds of acres. Wright-Patterson Air Force Base employed tens of thousands more. Meade Paper Company was here, Standard Register, Reynolds and Reynolds. Dayton had 6 Fortune 500 headquarters, a feat that only 14 American cities could match. The arcade was bustling. Wrights was thriving. Its downtown store had become a civic institution with a rooftop restaurant, a famous toy floor, and Christmas window displays that drew families from across the Miami Valley. In 1945, Frederick Reich had secured from NCR a set of mechanical Charles Dickens figures, originally displayed in the company's New York office windows, and installed them in his own storefront at 2nd and Main. Generations of children pressed their faces against that glass. The city called itself the City of 1,000 Factories, and for once a civic boast was roughly accurate. Per capita income in the Dayton area was within striking distance of Boston's and Seattle's. If you stood on the corner of 3rd and Main in 1960, you were standing in the center of a city that worked, a place where a man with a high school diploma could walk into a factory and earn enough to buy a house, raise a family, and retire with a pension. That world was about as durable as the levees had been. The first crack was suburban. Shopping centers drew customers out of downtown, and the department stores followed. Reichs opened branches at suburban malls, while the downtown flagship slowly dimmed. The interstates came through. I-70 east-west, I-75 north-south, I-675 as a partial beltway. They were supposed to connect Dayton to the national economy. What they actually did was make it easy to live 20 miles from the city center and never go downtown at all. The deeper damage was industrial. NCR began shedding manufacturing jobs in the early 1970s as the company pivoted from mechanical cash registers to computing. The great daylight factories that Patterson had built were designed for hands, for assembling gears and cranks and keys. They were not designed for circuit boards. By the 1990s, a Brown Street plant that had once employed 20,000 people now employed 200. General Motors, under pressure from Japanese competition and its own bureaucratic weight, began closing plants across the Dayton area. Fisher Body went in 1989. Frigidaire was already gone. The Dayton Tire Plant closed in 1981. A factory that had employed over 1,000 people became, within a few years, a prairie. In the 1980s, Dayton had more than 600 machine shops, the small suppliers and tool makers that formed the industrial ecosystem, the same ecosystem that had given the Wright brothers a machinist like Charlie Taylor on 6 weeks' notice. By the 1990s, that number had fallen by half. There used to be more CEOs who could make immediate decisions on community issues, said Dave Ponitz, president of Sinclair Community College in 1996. What he meant was that Dayton had lost more than factories. It had lost the executives who sat on hospital boards and funded parks and decided over lunch at the Biltmore that the city needed a new concert hall. When the companies left, the civic infrastructure started to dissolve. The arcade closed on March 31, 1990. It had tried to reinvent itself as an urban mall in the 1980s, anchored by McCrory's department store and Charlie's Crab Seafood restaurant. But it couldn't compete with the suburban shopping centers that its own city's highways had made possible. Holidays celebrations during the 1992 and 1993 Christmas seasons drew more than 100,000 shoppers downtown, but they were visiting a memory. After 1993, the arcade stood empty. The utilities were disconnected, water seeped in, vandals stripped the copper, windows were boarded up. The city began getting quotes for demolition. The glass dome, 70 feet high, 90 feet across, with its stone turkeys and cornucopias, stood in the dark, streaked with water stains, surrounded by peeling paint and artificial wreaths from the last Christmas anyone had tried. Reiche's main downtown store was imploded in 1999. The site became the Schuster Performing Arts Center. The Biltmore Hotel was converted to senior housing in 1981. Dayton's last major moment on the world stage came in November 1995, when the peace accord that ended the war in Bosnia was negotiated at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base and became known, to the city's bittersweet pride, as the Dayton Agreement. The population fell from 262,332 in 1960 to 182,044 in 1990. To 166,179 in 2000. In 1980, per capita income in the Seattle area had been only 16% higher than Dayton's. By 2016, it was 73% higher. Then came 2008 and 2009, and Dayton lost everything at once. On December 23, 2008, 2 days before Christmas, the last SUV, a white GMC Envoy, rolled off the line at the General Motors assembly plant in Moraine, just south of the city. The plant had produced more than 6 million vehicles over the decades. On a typical shift, workers there could turn out more than 400 SUVs. At its peak, traffic around the plant during shift changes had created gridlock so bad that Moraine police avoided the area entirely. Now it was over. 1,100 workers lost their jobs that day. 6 months later, in June 2009, NCR announced it was moving its corporate headquarters to Duluth, Georgia, a suburb of Atlanta. Georgia had offered $60 million in incentives. Ohio's leaders said they hadn't even been asked to match the offer. NCR CEO Bill Newty, who had never moved to Dayton as his contract required, would later call the relocation a great move for NCR. 1,200 more jobs left or were eliminated. NCR had been headquartered in Dayton for 125 years, from the era of Ritty's incorruptible cashier to the age of the barcode scanner, and it was gone. Patterson's campus, the daylight factories, the landscaped grounds. The University of Dayton bought 115 acres. Today, it houses research offices and parking lots. A Chinese auto glass company called Fuyao eventually moved into the old GM plant in Moraine, employing more than 2,000 people. But starting wages were around $15 an hour, a fraction of what GM had paid. When the billionaire founder of Fuyao was asked about the gap, he said the proper comparison was not to what people used to make in Dayton, but to wages in Mexico and China. By that measure, he said, the pay looked fine. This was true. And it captured something no amount of civic optimism could paper over. Dayton's competition was no longer Columbus or Cincinnati. It was Guangzhou. The opioid crisis hit Dayton like a second flood. In the first half of 2017, nearly 400 people died of overdoses in Montgomery County alone, a rate so extreme that the county coroner deployed refrigerator trucks normally reserved for mass casualty events. The population, which had been 262,332 in 1960, fell below 140,000. One-third of residents lived in poverty. In West Dayton, the old factory districts had become vacant lots, grass growing through concrete, smokestacks standing alone in fields of rubble like headstones. And yet, in March 2021, the Dayton Arcade reopened. A $95 million redevelopment, the most expensive historic rehabilitation in the city's history, had transformed the complex into housing, artist studios, co-working space, and small retail. The University of Dayton moved its entrepreneurship center into one of the buildings. A second phase, adding a 93-room Hilton Garden Inn and more retail, was underway. When people stepped inside and looked up at the rotunda for the first time in a quarter century, the reaction was visceral. The glass dome, cleaned, restored, flooded with light, still had its stone turkeys, its cornucopias, its garlands of grain. It was the same dome Eugene Barney had built in 1904, when Dayton was busy inventing the 20th century and didn't know it. It's the most emotional building in Dayton, one of the developers said. It's because of the unabashed beauty, as well as all the generations and the layers of history. It's part of our DNA. DNA is a good word for it, because the strange thing about Dayton is that its legacy is everywhere except Dayton. Every time you start a car with a key, you're using a Dayton invention. Every time you open a pull-top can, scan a barcode, check an airline flight, look at a liquid crystal display. Every time a computer processes a transaction at a cash register, the ghost of James Riddy's incorruptible cashier is in the room. IBM, the company Thomas Watson built after Patterson fired him, became one of the most influential corporations in the 20th century. General Motors, which absorbed Delco and Frigidaire and the Dayton Wright Airplane Company, became the largest company in the world. The code-breaking machines that Joe Desch built in Building 26 helped win a war and laid groundwork for the computing age. Wright-Patterson Air Force Base still conducts over $4 billion in research annually. The Air Force Research Laboratory, headquartered there, is one of the most advanced military research facilities on Earth. Dayton's children are everywhere. They just don't come home. Sit with that for a moment. A city so good at producing talent that it produced its own obsolescence. Patterson created the modern sales organization and the modern factory, and the men he trained took those ideas to companies in New York, Detroit, Chicago, and San Francisco. Kettering invented the electric starter and let GM take it to Michigan. The Wrights built the airplane and eventually sold the company. Even the buildings left. Ford took the bicycle shop. Building 26 was torn down. None of the structures Patterson filled during his lifetime survive. There is a historical marker on the corner of Main Street and Monument Avenue in downtown Dayton, an 8-by-8-inch brick medallion set in the pavement. It reads, Innovation Capital of the World. It sits 15 blocks from where the Wright Brothers worked, 2 miles from where Patterson founded NCR, and a few hundred yards from the Arcade Rotunda. Most people walk over it without looking down. At 1127 West 3rd Street, where the first airplane was built, a wrought iron fence surrounds a large grassy lot. The commercial buildings on either side of it, 19th century brick, still stand. The lot is mowed, it is tidy. There is no airplane in it, no bicycle shop, no wind tunnel. A sign explains what was here. If you stand at the fence on a quiet afternoon, you're looking at the most important empty space in the history of American innovation. The place where 2 bicycle mechanics changed the world, using $5,000 and a rented building, in a city that was so full of people solving problems that nobody noticed 2 more until the whole world did. The building is in Michigan now. The airplane is in Washington. The lot is in Dayton, which is where it all started, and which is still, for better or worse, here.